college writing professor, creative writing professor, Maryrose Wood, not only inspires her students to tap into their creative intellects, but also has explored Broadway acting and comedic stylings. She now writes books for children and teens. Today she shares with us her latest works and the process of her journey. Maryrose, it's a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
What motivated you to tell stories, which is what a writer does, right? You're just basically telling stories.
It's absolutely what a writer does. In fact, that's one of the messages that I try and imprint upon my students as quickly as possible, that writing is not just a question of putting words on paper, that writing is about telling a story, engaging a reader, you know, doing something that makes a difference, that really communicates. I was always interested in the world of story, but as your introduction pointed out, I didn't actually begin knowing that I wanted to be a writer. I was attracted to the world of the theater, which to me as a young person in high school, around my teen years, was the most vivid experience of storytelling that I had had. I was very attracted to the world of performing.
So it was the theater that inspired you at first?
Very much so. And in fact, when I graduated high school, I enrolled at NYU as an acting major. So my first career plan was to be a performer. And I did, with a great stroke of luck, you know, unexpected good things that happen in life are so often very influential. For me, it was while I was still a college student, I was cast in a Broadway show. So I left school and sort of was thrust in this acting career that lasted for a while, but I sort of quickly became restless, and the restlessness that I felt was the desire to want to be the storyteller, not necessarily interpreting stories that other people created, which is what an actor does.
Absolutely.
And it's very creative work and very important work. But I was always looking at the script thinking, oh, what if it was like this? You know, what if it went this way? Or what if my character said this? And I got in touch with the fact that I really wanted to be the one who was creating the plot and the characters.
And then when you started, did you start with plays? It would be a natural transition, right?
It absolutely was. That was the world that I knew. So my first work as a writer was as a playwright. And I wrote plays for a long time and screenplays as well. And then I kind of circled back to my first love as a performer, which was the musical theater, and I worked for some time as a lyricist and librettist for musical theater. So I explored many forms of dramatic writing before I worked up the courage to write fiction. And I'm grateful that I learned to do it that way, because I think I have a grounding towards story and character that is very much in the bone, you know, as opposed to being more focused on the language. I love good language in writing, but I think that it's only half of the equation.
Before we get to your books, tell me a little bit about your class. What do you teach? You teach creative writing.
Yes, I'm a fairly new addition to the teaching staff in the English department here at Lehman College. I've taught fiction writing now for 3 semesters. I've taught undergrads and graduate students. And I've been so impressed with the passion of the students here, because to write fiction is very hard work, to write well.
It takes a lot of imagination, not only a good writer, but imagination, right?
It takes a tremendous amount of imagination. It takes a tremendous amount of discipline, because you are, you know, on your own. You are reaching inside yourself. You know, you're not responding. It's not a passive task. You are reaching inside yourself to find the stories that you have to tell. And what many young writers are inspired by are the books that they read, the authors that they love. And they come into a fiction writing course filled with this desire to want to have that experience in their own work. But of course, the process of writing is very different than the process of reading. Reading is neat, and it happens from left to right, and it's all finished, and you get lost in it, and it seems like it was there since the dawn of time. You know, a good book looks like it just fell whole out of the sky. But the process of writing is very messy. And it has a lot of false starts, and you write a lot of things you don't end up using, and you have to revise everything you do 1,000,000 times. So it's an engagement with process and that kind of work of learning to be personal, but then also be able to step back and apply your craft to it with a critical eye. So
tell me about creating characters, because that's also an important component, I would think, when you're writing fiction. Is like, you know, you have this new person that you created, or maybe it's a person that's half fiction, half real, because you know somebody that's sort of like that, and you adapt them.
You can get into trouble if you do that too much.
Really? I imagine so, yes. But tell me about that character that you've created. Does it take a life of its own, and then you feel like you know this person that you created?
In my experience as a writer, that's very much the case. Where the inspiration for a character comes from is always a hodgepodge, as you described. Yes, you make things up from your imagination, and you also think about people that you've known, and you look in your own heart, and you find facets of yourself and blow them out of proportion and change them and use them in different ways, right? And you also might find inspiration in characters that you've loved in literature. You know, the main character in my series, The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place, is a young governess in Victorian England. And whenever I'm asked where the inspiration came from to write a governess, I said, well, you should have seen me as a teenager. I read Jane Eyre cover to cover more times than I could tell you. I used to get to the end of the book and I'd say, oh, I want to read it again. I'd go back to the beginning and I'd read it again. So you take freely from all of these things. But then once you put it together and you start writing, sometimes the characters really do start to reveal themselves to you.
But they also have to have a consistency, right? You can't have a character who really contradicts himself, or is not, you know, you don't want to have with a person in the first half of the book that turns into another person. You have to have some kind of...
You have to know your character well. And the other thing, and this is something that I talk with my students about a lot, the character doesn't exist independently of the story. You know, the story of a well-crafted work of fiction, of narrative fiction, is a journey, and it's a journey of transformation. I like to say it's a one-way ticket. When we read a great story, the character that we've read about is a little different at the end, or maybe a lot different at the end. The world of the character has been changed by what's happened, and hopefully the reader has also been changed by taking this journey along with them. If you get to the end of the book and you don't feel like something's changed, you're like, oh, it's disappointing. Like, what was the point? You know, it's something we look for as readers. And so your character is a person who, just by virtue of being the main character in a fictional work, is going on a journey of transformation. And everything about them has to somehow be connected organically to what that journey is. So the journey is the character is the journey. It's not about random events. It's a pretty tightly crafted job to make that make sense.
So tell me about your first book, The Poison Diaries?
Well, The Poison Diaries is not my first book.
It's your second book.
It's I've written a lot of books actually, but these are the ones I'm working on now.
Okay.
They're my most recent books. That's how we'll characterize them.
So which one came first, though, The Poison Diaries or The Incorrigible Children?
I actually started working on The Incorrigible Children.
All right, tell me about that one first.
Absolutely. It's a series for what is called in the publishing industry middle grade readers, which is starting at about age 8 and up. And it's going to be a 6-book series in total. The book you're holding is The Hidden Gallery, and that's the second book in the series and the most recent one to be published. It is set in Victorian England. The main character is a 15-year-old girl named Miss Penelope Lumley, who's a recent graduate of a school called the Swanbourne Academy for Poor Bright Females. In the first book, she's on her way to a job interview, having already graduated from her school, at this grand house, and the job is to be a governess, and only after she is interviewed and accepts the job does she discover that the 3 children who will be her pupils were actually raised by wolves. So so it's a comic concept that also has a lot of fun with the familiar elements of Victorian governess fiction, and there's a lot of mystery involved because she not only has to teach them to behave themselves like children and not puppies, but also wants to discover the mystery of who they really are and who left them in the forest to be raised by wolves to begin with.
So this one is for children, and The Poison Diaries is for teenagers.
Yes. So
and what is happening there in The Poison Diaries?
The Poison Diaries trilogy is actually inspired by a real place in the county of Northumberland in England, there's this wonderful old castle called Alnwick Castle. And when the Duchess of Northumberland became the Duchess of Northumberland, she did a huge renovation to the castle and the grounds. And one of the things that she had built was this magnificent garden of only poisonous plants, which you can actually go visit and take a tour of. It's really interesting. So the castle and the garden became an inspiration for a young adult trilogy about the world of poisonous plants. And there's a character in the book who's a young man who actually has this ability to communicate with the plants. And they are not very nice, I must say, the poisonous plants. So it's this kind of gothic romance that has this supernatural element of the poisonous plants also.
And you have a co-author in this book.
The Duchess of Northumberland is credited, rightly so, for coming up with the notion of setting these books in this poison garden, which is really fascinating. And getting to visit her castle, meet her, and visit the poison garden was also one of the highlights of developing the series.
For both of these books, you've basically had to move your mind to England and to a different world, right? I mean, I would imagine you're American, you're from New York, right?
And I live in the Bronx.
And you live in the Bronx, and so, you know, how do you write about private girls' schools in England?
It's a combination of imagination and research. It is a lot of work to write historical fiction, which this really is. I mean, the Incorrigible Children series is set in the Victorian era around the year 1850. The Poison Diaries is set even earlier. It's set in the 1790s, sort of the era of the Romantic poets in England. And I have learned so much by writing these books. I've had to do a lot of research on all kinds of topics, everything from botany.
A lot of fact-checking,
A lot of fact-checking. There's quite a lot of fact-checking. But I find that research is also a source of inspiration. And there are many times that I'm looking just to check a fact about something, and I'll stumble across an interesting tidbit. For example, I didn't know until I started to write the Incorrigible Children books that ferns, the plants, ferns were incredibly popular in Victorian England. People were obsessed with ferns. They used to collect them. They had fern societies. And that's the kind of thing that I just love as a writer, because it's something I can weave in to the story and have this kind of running joke about how her fondness for ferns. You know, it's a great source of material.
Well, we're out of time, but you have to come back and talk to me about your students and the kind of stories that they're writing.
Oh, I would love to do that.
So we'll do that soon, okay?
Great.
And tell us where we can get your books. Where can we purchase them?
You can purchase my books anywhere books are sold. You can find them at major bookstores or online retailers, and I hope that you will support your local independent bookseller if you have one nearby, because that's a great place to buy books.